Continuing on with the work of Wilhelm Reich. This is about sadism. The definition of sadism: the tendency to derive pleasure from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation to others. This is a behavioral and social disorder. Apparently, the reason why I'm talking about it now is because I believe that it's growing in American society as we speak. Sadism is basically self-hate and, to some degree, self-murder, self-denial. So, drawing on the work of Wilhelm Reich on Freudian psychology, we'll go further into this. In short, I pointed out the role played by destructiveness in the development of anxiety. 6 months later, Freud demonstrated the connection between conscious anxiety and the repressed instinct of destruction. At the same time, however, he minimized its connection with sexual anxiety. This was logical within his system, for after all, he considered destruction primary biological instinct, equal to sexuality. In the meantime, I had demonstrated the correlation between the intensity of the destructive impulse and the intensity of sexual stasis, and had differentiated aggression and destruction. Those differentiations, as theoretical as specialized as they may appear, are of fundamental importance. They led in an entirely different direction from the Freudian conception of destruction. Sadism, the reassessment of aggression, is of enormous importance for the rearing of children. Much of the inhibition of aggression, which our children have to endure to their own detriment, is the result of equating aggressive with wicked or sexual. In quotes. Aggression is always an attempt to provide the means for the gratification of a vital need. Thus, aggression is not an instinct in the strict sense of the word. Rather, it is the indispensable means of gratifying every instinctual impulse. The latter is inherently aggressive because the tension demands gratification. Hence, there is a destructive or sadistic and a sexual aggressiveness. If aggressive sexuality is denied gratification, the urge to gratify it in spite of the denial continues to make itself felt. Indeed, the impulse arises to experience the desired pleasure at all costs. The need for aggression begins to drown out the need for love. If the pleasurable goal is completely eliminated, an example would be made unconscious or imbued with anxiety, then aggression, which originally was only a means, becomes a tension-releasing action in itself. It becomes pleasurable as an expression of life, thus giving rise to sadism. Hate develops as a result of the exclusion of the original goal of love. Let me repeat that. Hate develops as a result of the exclusion of the original goal of love. And the hate is most intense when the act of loving or being loved is blocked. This is what brings the sexually motivated destructive intention into the aggressive action. An example of this would be a sexual murder. Its precondition is the complete blocking of the ability to enjoy genital pleasure in a natural way. Thus, the perversion/sadism is a mixture of primary sexual impulses and secondary destructive impulses. It does not exist anywhere else in the animal kingdom, and it is the characteristic of man acquired late in his development, a secondary drive. Every seemingly arbitrary destructive action is a reaction of the organism to the frustration of the gratification of a vital need, especially a sexual need. So I'm going to repeat that last statement. It basically sums up this first part. Every seemingly arbitrary destructive action is a reaction of the organism to the frustration of a gratification of a vital need, especially a sexual need. That's worth paying attention to. Between 1924 and 1927, as these connections became clear to me in their basic characteristics, I nonetheless continued to use the term death instinct in my publications in order not to have to break from the ranks, as the common terminology was at the time. In my clinical work, I rejected the death instinct. I did not discuss its biological interpretation because I had nothing to say about it. In everyday practice, it appeared as a destructive impulse. However, I had already formulated the dependence of the destructive impulse on sexual stasis, initially according to its intensity. I left open the question as to the biological nature of destructiveness. It was also necessary to be cautious in the view of the scantiness of the facts. What was clear even then, however, was that every suppression of sexual impulses provokes hate, non-directed aggressiveness, i.e., motor restlessness without a rational goal, and destructive tendencies. Numerous examples from clinical experience, everyday life, and the animal kingdom readily come to mind to show this. It was impossible to overlook the reduction of hate impulses in patients who had acquired the ability to obtain natural sexual pleasure. Let me repeat that. It was impossible to overlook the reduction of hate impulses in patients who had acquired the ability to obtain natural sexual pleasure. Every conversion of a compulsion, neurosis, into a hysteria was accompanied by a reduction of hate. Sadistic perversions or sadistic fantasies in the sexual act decreased to the extent to which gratification was increased. These insights enable us to understand the increase in marital conflicts when sexual attraction and gratification decrease. It has also enabled us to understand the disappearance of marital brutality when another gratifying partner is found. I inquired into the behavior of wild animals and learned that they are harmless when they are well fed and sexually gratified. I could observe this phenomenon in spiteful spinsters and aesthetic moralists in society. By contrast, persons capable of genital gratification were conspicuously gentle and good. A person capable of sexual gratification is never sadistic. I'll repeat that one. A person capable of sexual gratification is never sadistic. If such a person becomes sadistic, it could be safely assumed that a sudden disturbance has obstructed the useful gratification. This was also born out of the behavior of women in menopause. There are climacterical women who show no trace of spitefulness or irritational hate, and others who develop hateful characteristics in the menopause insofar as they did not already have them. There can be no question that the difference in behavior is due to their prior genital experience. The second type are always women who had never had a gratifying love relationship and now regret this lack consciously or unconsciously, sensing the consequences of sexual stasis. An important source of genital excitation had been disclosed. By eliminating destructive aggressiveness and sadism, energy can be liberated and transferred to the genital. Soon it was shown that orgastic potency is incompatible with strong destructive or sadistic impulses. One cannot want to gratify the partner genitally and simultaneously want to destroy the partner. That's pretty key right there. Let me repeat that. One cannot want to gratify the partner genitally and simultaneously want to destroy the partner. So there we go. What Wilhelm Reich is getting at is building upon the work of Sigmund Freud, where we realize that neurotic behavior, behavioral disorders, can be so deeply subconscious due to our early childhood and upbringing, oftentimes trauma or emotional or physical abuse. And some of that can be very mild appearing trauma, but weighs in heavily on the child's psyche because the child is wide open with no references of good or bad or right or wrong. So what needs to be said here is that we've realized that the formation of the ego and the psyche occur with fundamental elements already in the biology of the human being. And maybe the most fundamental element is the vital force, or you could say libido, or you could say the sexual drive. But it should be known that this is not necessarily about sexuality. It's about the way in which all creatures have a drive to survive and to recreate themselves or procreate. That is a vital elemental force in nature, and it expresses itself in human beings in our psychological development. And what Wilhelm Reich is showing here is that when the memes of society, i.e. family and village and society, do not interfere with your base biology functions, then you can have a pure sexual vital force express itself throughout the being. And there'll be no neurosis, basically no trauma to the ego. And he's also shown that under the right type of therapy, full body orgasms can actually cure deep-seated neuroses and bring someone into the place of centeredness, oceanic experience, and womb-like experience, because it creates an energetic balance in the physiology of the body when it's done correctly. A little bit more. The inhibition of sexual excitation produces a contradiction that grows steadily worse. The inhibition increases the sexual excitation. The increased stasis weakens the ability of the organism to reduce the stasis, and as a consequence, the organism acquires a fear or excitation. In other words, a sexual anxiety. What he's saying here is that if you have an inhibition, a sexual inhibition, it's gonna detract from your ability to have a full instinctual, natural orgasm. And most of us are unaware if we have this problem. But if we do, there is all different levels of inhibition when it comes to the sexual act, and even more importantly, the sexual climax, the orgasm itself. And he goes into all these different types of inhibition, and they're worth noting. The most common one is when a person can't help it, but they hold their breath during climax or orgasm. That's a telltale sign that there is some inhibition there and some sort of psychological neurosis that should be made conscious and addressed. Moving on. Hence, sexual anxiety is caused by the external frustration of instinctual gratification and is internally anchored by the fear of the dammed up sexual excitation. This leads to orgasm anxiety, which is the ego's fear of the overpowering excitation of the genital system due to its estrangement from the experience of pleasure. Orgasm anxiety constitutes the core of the universal biologically anchored pleasure anxiety. Let me repeat that. Orgasm anxiety constitutes the core of the universal biologically anchored pleasure anxiety. So what he's talking about here is people that are afraid of living, people that are afraid of life, also known as the death instinct. People that won't allow themselves to be free, so to speak, be vitally, energetically engaged and joyful, engaging with life. He's saying that the core of this problem is actually a fear related to the instinctual orgasm. So this is a genital disturbance and a psychological behavioral problem that can be cured with most people. It is usually expressed as a general anxiety about every form of vegetative sensation and excitation, or the perception of such excitations and sensations. The pleasure of living and the pleasure of the orgasm are identical. Extreme orgasm anxiety forms the basis of the general fear of life. Okay, so I suggest listening to this video one more time. It's a lot of, psychological and scientific language, but if you listen to it twice, it will start to make sense, and it's definitely well worth studying this topic because we are all familiar with the body, and we are all familiar with sexuality, and we are all familiar with orgasm. And not only that, it's completely natural. All creatures, especially all mammals, experience a sexual orgasm when procreating or recreating themselves or their species. So it's the most natural event of creation in creation. So we can all relate to it in some way, shape, or form. And it's just good to look at the development of the psyche in relation to the vital living force within us. So please share the work of Wilhelm Reich.